This video is brought to you by Trophy Bone Artistry of Central City, Nebraska. They didn't actually sponsor me, but when I started reading this book, I was attending a fish and game convention with my father, and picked up their business card, which I used as a thematically appropriate bookmark for the rest of my two read-throughs. Visit their Facebook page at trophyboneartistry.com to see their collection of high-detailed painted barnwood, hides, and skull mounts. I received no money for doing this bit. The passage that is about to follow was my introduction to a truly bizarre work of writing. Aristotle reports that birds never fly backwards or tail first. This is not simply a fact of avian ethology, but an exponent of a world's choreographies, which are unlimited in principle. Thus, any exhibition of the resulting world must cohibit these choreographies, i.e., must enclose in their series a finite form itself contributory to those movements. Movements are world makers, of exactly the sort that worlds make, etching ontogenesis over the earth, by way of which the latter acquires lithic morpholex in consequence of what is made of them. A mark's being made renders any actual beginnings of directionality into reference for subsequent movements. But nothing dictates that such later movements merely continue or issue from their precursor states. Later advents may reorient earlier, with morphogenetic vortices repeatedly refashioning or even revoking the axes of antecedent forms. Hence, Aristotle's law of motion, according to which the antecedent has its actuality in the consequent, applies alike in figures and things animate. In nature, nothing has a movement backwards. Aristotle, The Progression of Animals, 322 BC. On September 28, 2021, while doing some research for a video, I happened to find a lengthy post on r/paleontology. It was an iceberg-style meme, common for the time, exploring some of the stranger points of discussion in the history of paleontology. On the line between the fourth and fifth layers, far left, not yet midway through the depths of the post, a single phrase caught my attention: Spinal Catastrophism. I had no frame of reference for what this term could mean. Between ideas of big paleo, neo-geocentrism, and a court case against a Tyrannosaurus skeleton, two words invoked utterly bizarre concepts. Was this a horrific disease, a reference to poor skeletal structures, a long-standing malpractice of the chiropractic industry? I needed to know, and the results I found on Google were less than enlightening. A release page from MIT Press and a blob of technical jargon did little to ease my confusion. Utterly confounded by the reviews, but with my interest now piqued, I ordered the book. $17.95 shipping, handling, and a standard business week later, I hit a brick wall of some of the densest intellectual work I've ever come in contact with. Being who I was, I took this as a challenge. I knew I needed to understand what this book was about, out of my own scholarly curiosity and pride as a stubborn pseudo-academic. Whether or not anyone else cared, I wanted to be able to say that I had conquered this bony beast of a book and claimed whatever treasures lied within. I'm proud to say, I think I did. And now I want to share my findings with you. This video will break down, as full as I am capable, the themes, arguments, and logical flow of this secret history, and bring us to the mind-breaking twist that awaits us at the story's end. To once more quote the preface, page 7. What could be more historical than a creation? And so, philosophical assiduity be damned, fill me from the crown to toe topful with impious enormity. Supererogation and suspicion pushed aside, this book explores where, and how far, certain arguably wrong-minded thinkers have been able to travel along the twisted path of a genealogy that isn't suspicious of the winding relation between person and planet, but rather revisits, and in some cases reignites, the superlative dimensions of this filiation. This twisted path, again and again, turns out to be precisely that line from crown to toe, the vertical axis of the human body and its bony ledger, the spinal column. This is because, for a nature with a history, an anatomy is just a memory, and we have had spines for as long as we've had brains. Can it be a coincidence that so many thinkers have been drawn to a certain heady admixture of notions, a theoretical superlation that only lately has been christened Spinal Catastrophism? What is spinal catastrophism? Or spinal catastrophism? I'm not really sure how you pronounce it, and I don't think anyone really has a good answer. Anyways, it's kind of hard to explain. In short, spinal catastrophism, this book, is the proposition of a perspective on natural history, one which analyzes philosophy, geology, psychology, and biology, among other fields, by using the human nervous system, and spine in particular, as a sort of archaeological artifact. By inspecting its form and function, and all of the quirks there within, we might be able to ascertain a deeper understanding of the human condition, and what it means to exist as we currently do. Spinal Catastrophism is written by Thomas Moynihan. As his about page states, he is a UK-based writer and researcher with a PhD from Oriel College on the history of human extinction. He's mainly interested in the history of existential risk and existential hope, that is, how people first came to understand the perils and promises that face us as a species. To him, this is the central philosophical drama of the modern world, how we came to appreciate our position and precarity as moral agents within an otherwise seemingly silent and sterile universe. Spinal Catastrophism was published by Urbanomic and the MIT Press in 2019, and the book draws heavily from the works of Daniel Charles Barker, professor of anorganic semiotics at Kingsport College from 1992 to 2000, although we'll talk more about him later. Connecting Barker's work back through its origins through thinkers and writers across the globe, Moynihan seeks to answer a few central questions. What is the answer to the Fermi paradox? With all of these habitable planets proposed to exist, where are all of the aliens? Furthermore, what is the relationship between person and planet? Or rather, what is the nature of the connection between conscious life as we understand it and the conditions that give rise to it? How far back does this relationship extend? How does conscious life emerge? And what changes does it undergo to reach our current point of development? And finally, what is the ontological endpoint of life and conscious existence? What about our future can we divine from the spine? Now, for most of these questions, Moynihan does actually find some pretty convincing answers, but to get there, we're going to have to work our way through nearly 300 pages of esoteric knowledge. And I don't mean that in the, ooh, Hyperborea, edit Brian, ooh, Agartha, ooh, Dodon Skull, Yakub, Ooga Booga, Kali Yuga type of esoteric. I mean, like, legitimately obscure facts and theories. Now, a full read-through of this book, while a fun idea, would make this video even longer and more confusing, which is why, out of the graciousness of my heart, I read through this book a second time and wrote a 33-page bulleted annotation. We'll review my notes and come to conclusions about the themes, motifs, and legitimacy of this novel at its conclusion. A final, fair warning. If you at all have an interest in reading this book, take the time to read it before watching this video. Clawing my way through the literature was a truly novel experience, pun intended. And if you're up to the task, I can highly recommend diving in head first. Although, unless you're a masochist, skip the preface. It's beautiful language and makes tons more sense after you've read the book, but it's not strictly necessary to understand it, and Ian Hamilton Grant has a slightly more confusing style of voice than Moynihan's own work. That being said, if you do want to go chapter by chapter, you can read through the book and then go through the corresponding section I'll bring up in the video, because I'll be going chapter by chapter. All of that being said, let us finally start at the beginning. Cervical prospectus. This section establishes a lot of the basic arguments for the rest of the discussion. Be warned, a lot of everything I'm going to say won't fully make sense at first, or lead directly into the following thought. Thomas loves his tangents, and I have to skimp on the detail in a few places to keep this succinct. My annotations also got more detail the more I did them, so keep that in mind, that the video is probably going to get more detailed on the sections as we go on. Additionally, while I could take the time to explain every piece of jargon, I won't. So sometimes I'm going to say words and you just kind of need to understand what they mean. Google is your friend here. When I first read through the book, I just kept a tally of like 40 words in the preface alone I had to look up. And I have a pretty big vocabulary. C1. A giga-annum of genealogy. Philosophical genealogy is the unveiling of causes, masquerading as reasons, at least in classical genealogy. We hold beliefs accidentally, because of background and upbringing. We don't hold them because of careful and deliberate rationalization. For most opinions or stances that make up our person, there wasn't a Socratic dialogue behind them, just an observation and a subconscious abstraction or multiple abstractions taken from those observable phenomenon. To explain this, historical figures point to different factors. Marx wrote of class struggles in economic terms, Freud of the Oedipal drama in psychological terms. Both men's explanations, like many others, were limited to their own vocabularies in order to increase internal consistency, to provide a more consistent argument as to why their beliefs about beliefs were better. The entirety of classical genealogy is a rational enterprise that reserves suspicion for specific areas, localized to a domain or field of study, and it doesn't zoom out far enough to examine the idea of rationality itself, at least not often. Hypergenealogy, on the other hand, liquidates all technical fields into a slew of equally accessible jargon. It is genealogy on steroids, abandoning all responsibility for aligning every minute detail of its musings. By suspending suspicion of one's own arguments, the thinker is no longer concerned with creating better or more consistent arguments, but instead creating more arguments. It's a spray and pray strategy. The goal is to reveal as much as possible by examining as much as possible, and that includes examining the process of examination. The analysis spirals in on itself, allowing the small scope of a singular human experience to be reconciled against the enormities of a vast natural history. Remember, movements are world makers of exactly the sorts that worlds make. If you can pin down why the smaller artifact exists as it does, you can extrapolate out the larger system that created it. What could be more historical than a creation? C2. Cervical zenith. Immanuel Kant's first critique orients reason in relation to the planetary surface, and thus to human bipedalism. While our perspective standing on the Earth appears to show it as an indefinite flat plane, we can intuit that it is in fact spherical. Likewise, reason does not expand flatly out from a single origin, but is also spherical. Traveling far enough will cause recursion, and your conclusions will bring you right back to your assumptions. Our personal experience is separate from what we can appraise. Kant further traces humanity's unique capacity to reason this factor out from our vertical posture. The further from the ground you get, the more capable you are of noticing the Earth's spherical shape. The shape of our body is such that, tracing from our head to our feet, we naturally intuit this abstraction. Our spines aren't tangent to the circle's edge, but aligned radially outwards towards the solar zenith. Page 13. What Kant's spinal thought experiment hits at, then, is that Homo sapiens' ability to exert cognizance and control on a planetary scale results from the same species-specific peculiarity as its susceptibility to back pain. C3. Spirit and bone. I'm recognizing now that's actually a reference to the essay Spirit and Teeth by Nick Land. Moynihan, you clever motherfucker. A previous argument of Kant had based reason in leftness and rightness, the fact of human bilateral symmetry. Long story short, there is a precedent to his idea that reason was grounded in our bone structures. Moving on, he talks of how having a perception is separate from believing that perception to be objective. We can only establish a sphere of knowledge by relating our experiences at one moment to those of another. We set limits on what is permissible as part of that established logical domain. This creates a structure of reason with its own internal rules. However, because the area outside of this domain is a messy web of tactile experiences, outside experiences can't just be fed in raw. Page 17. Yet, at the same time, it is also true of a nervous system that it can only experience its own states or its own inputs. It is receptive, of course, but only in the language of its own inputs. In the same way in which a model Kantian rational agent can only obey rational rules, i.e. those set by itself, there is a definite sense in which a nervous system only experiences itself. It is only by creating this inner world that the outer, more complex and mystifying world can come into existence from the brain's perspective, so to speak. Engagement between the two is only possible through specialized neurological and rational apertures. The development of that inwards world and the tools for interacting with the outer have been ongoing for aeons. We've been collapsing inwards for long before we began orienting ourselves. C4. Chronogenesis. Important notes. If our mind is considered to be like a planet, consciousness is only the outer crust. There's a lot going on in the mantle that we can't always see. As well, life exists as a system that expends energy to maintain itself, and it is selected to get better at doing that exact thing. Page 23. It causes itself to exist, and in doing so, becomes more involved in causing itself to exist. The circadian cycle is responsible for giving animals a sense of time, but the chronoreceptivity of that animal varies with the depth of its neural structures. These structures are made more complex by further retreating into the structure, creating a better simulation of the outside world, a process of self-interment. So we get this idea that life is continually folding in on itself in order to get more capable at experiencing the outside world and creating models of how to observe it and understand it, so that it can get better at surviving. Also, side note, on page 22, there exists an annotation that is not only twice as large as the block of text from which it is cited on the same page, together comprising all of the text on the page, but that then also stretches over into the citations at the bottom of the next page. And in this subsequent section of text, it is larger than the 3 other annotations on that page combined. That is wild. That is like nothing else I've ever seen in an academic work. C5. Belated cosmogony. Chronotope, a term developed by Russian neurophysicist A.N. Utomsky, refers to the way an organism inhabits a space-time structure developed by its own nervous system, by coordinating its inputs and outputs. The more an organism is fluent with itself, the more that the universe will explode outwards. You can think of it as improving the processing power of a computer by improving its ability to intake and then output information. However, notice that we do not experience the emulation of this artificial world. We don't feel the cortex at work. Our experiences are on the edge of the boundary between the inner and outer worlds. We're not always aware of what is going on underneath. What's novel about the spinal cord, then, is that it is a segmented, outward expanding record of the central nervous system, or CNS's, collapse inwards. Furthermore, because the inner world is separated and different than the actual, if you are capable of creating an inner world, you're capable of emulating a world chronologically distinct from the actual. In other words, we can experience the future. When you are doing this, you're capable of foresight, and by extension, you're given the tool to begin imagining ways to change the current world into your envisioned future. And this process is later enhanced through mathematics and computing, allowing life to get even better at escaping reality to create its own. However, we have hit a bit of a limit. As the model becomes better at modeling, it still can't model the model. That is, it can't fully include its own modeling without falling into infinite recursion, in much a similar sense to the hypergenealogy examination of reason. Does the set of all sets containing themselves contain themselves? The model has too much impact on the outside world to be considered a passive element that can be observed in the observation. The chronotope has a leak. Time here is seen as analogous to a biological secretion of the central nervous system. The spine is a symbol that expresses its object not by conveying it, but by manifesting it. Becoming aware of the future necessarily leads to conquering it. C6. Fearful symmetry. The more complex our world model becomes, the more that must be folded into it. However, the deeper we go, the greater the break in immersion becomes, to the point where our simulation borders on dysphoria. Page 41. The more conversant you are with time, that is to say, the more time inhabits you, the more painful life is going to be. We chordates are immanence's self-lacerating attempt to escape itself, or, what amounts to the same thing, a spine is the axial marker of nature's first attempts at dissimulation through simulation. Note again that Moynihan points out the body is constructed for better reasoning. The freedom of the human neck joint allows for a greater degree of redirection, helping in the search for orientation. The placement of our backs and bellies helps to better determine a sense of front and behind. The development of life from radially symmetrical to bilateral, and then from bilateral to encephalized, imparts an innate directionality into the animate organism. Passivity is abandoned when the face emerges. The frontwards jaw and sensory organs are objectified embodiments of hunger, predation, and lethality. The emergence of the skull. The Cambrian provides some of our first evidence for cannibalistic and infanticidal behavior. This fearful symmetry was the emergence of a terrible new era in the saga of life, and marked a turn in the development of the central nervous system. Page 45. The post-chordate world is utterly fallen. It is where veracity becomes self-selecting. Ultimately, the bilaterian face marks the cerebral fall from prelapsarian radial pacifism and ediacarian spinosessile innocence. But we fell upwards. Orthograde rationality came to superimpose itself upon bilaterian hunger, an appetite that could orient itself in thinking, and thus would eventually come to consume the whole globe. Felix culpa indeed. Note, Felix culpa translates to fortunate fault, and is most often used in the context of discussing original sin. Moynihan draws a direct comparison between the biblical fall of man from grace and the evolution of bilateral predation in life on Earth. C7. Traumata triumphant. Page 47. Bones are not concepts. Thank you, Moynihan. Thank you. Bones constrain the soft inner organs and enable greater control of motion, just by factor of their rigidity. In this way, they are a precursor to developing the concept of the finite, of finity, that there are restrictions to things that can be done. The 1755 Lisbon earthquakes fucked up Kant so badly that he wrote 3 essays about it. In these early publications, he discussed how we know much about the Earth's surface, but so little about the larger inner workings. The ground beneath our feet is not solid but moving, as seen by the theory of plate tectonics. He'd later go on to say roughly the same of the human psyche, establishing a link between the seismic and the psychic, that nothing is stable. In this chapter, we also find the concept that the spinal column can be directly used as a record of time. As the neural system awakens to time, it collapses and folds in on itself, and in doing so, captures part of the outside inside. Like a fossil record, the way that the biology of our ancestors was able to adapt to increased neurulation is preserved in the structures of the central nervous system. The rest of the book will descend down this spine, so to say, and in the same motion descend through time to understand the evolution of the human vertebrate and the thinkers who thought about it. Thoracic Retrospect, 2000 to 1900. This section is a retrospective on the origins of spinal catastrophism, as in the directly outlined concept. This involves citing similar lines of thought in a number of 19th and 20th century thinkers, from across many differing perspectives. We start with the main and most recent ideas, and sort of work backward into how they arose, in turn revealing much more about the ideas in themselves. You'll see this is, ironically, very reflective of the central tenets of spinal catastrophism. TH1. Barker spoke. Daniel Charles Barker, who first coined the term spinal catastrophism in his 1992 work, Plutonics, was a professor of anorganic semiotics at MVU, Michigan Virtual University. That's right, a professor of inorganic symbology at a virtual university in 1992. He's not very widely venerated, and Moynihan is relying on a lot of scattered fragments of Barker's theories, but we make things work. That's just how we do. Barker eventually came to work under NASA's SETI program due to his background in cryptography, or the study of encryption and decryption. But he was eventually ousted for his theories and misuse of department resources. He's compared to a questionable psychoanalyst Immanuel Velikovsky in this regard, who was likely one of Barker's influences. Both Velikovsky and Barker are considered neo-catastrophists. In the field of geohistory theory, there used to be two main schools of thought. Uniformitarians thought that all geological features are only the result of continuous observable processes over grand periods of time. Catastrophists, on the other hand, believed that while these cycles were key, geohistory is shaped more by one-off massive catastrophes with massive and lasting impacts on the planet. Page 59. However, this effectively made catastrophes forbidden in theorizations concerning the unobserved past. This is to say, due to empiricist anxieties about the requirements for legitimizing geohistory as a sensible and sense-based science, catastrophes have long been tarred with the brush of the unscientific. Uniformitarianism's overwhelming dominance was eventually overturned with the discovery of the Yucatan Peninsula's dinosaur-killing meteor. For the solar system, the Earth, and the mind, these things are true. Though they may appear steady on the surface from a single point in time, this betrays their true inner dynamism, available for perspective only across more vast periods of time. Neo-catastrophist tendencies have appeared in evolutionary science, discussions of biogenesis, and other scientific fields since. Now, Barker was a trained cryptographer, brought into NASA's SETA and METI programs to help identify any potential alien signals in the background radiation of the universe or anything other that they could detect. His work quickly became unorthodox, involving ideas that advanced civilizations were attempting to hide any signals that they put off, and that the Cambrian explosion was seeded by alien life. There are more crazy theories I'm sure were discussed in this chapter, but I cut them out with good reason. He reasoned that if any evidence of aliens would be found, the time scale of the universe was such that we'd likely first find archaeological artifacts that they left behind. If archaeological artifacts from dead alien races could be found, then maybe one form in which they might be found is in our own genome. Research from Yoku and Oshima in 1979 looked for meaningful symbols in a bacteriophage attacking E. coli in the human stomach. The idea is that the natural universe doesn't show signs of trying to hide itself. It doesn't care if anything observes it. So, traces of intentionally hiding your signal would be the signs of an alien race. And if we could find those traces of intentionality in the human genome, we could trace that back to make ourselves alien artifacts. As Aristides Erkopoulos and Professor Alfred Testa theorize in The New Cosmogony, we are the prime artifacts of a universal astroengineering project by type Omega intellects. A significantly advanced civilization could shape physics to turn gas giants or even the universe itself into a single neural system, and use this to advance their own interests. However, as Barker arguably spiraled into insanity, he both ran with and pushed against these ideas. To quote Barker on page 69 Nice, "To cut a long story short, it became increasingly obvious to me that although NASA said that they were hunting for intelligence, what they were really seeking was organization. The whole program was fundamentally misguided." Barker eventually turned his back on the panspermia idea. He believed that background noise is not a product of intentional organization. Instead, all galactic organization is the suppression of aboriginal noise. A signal is a noise that has deluded itself into thinking it is structure. Auto-repression, that's tension between returning to chaos and maintaining its order, is eventually expressed as internal trauma. For as Moynihan writes, we cannot take for granted that time and space are homogeneous. They may have a coarse grain. That is, the structure of galaxies, nebulas, and other large astral artifacts are known to have impacts on space-time through gravity and other nebulous forces. Therefore, there may be differences in how space-time works at point A compared to point B, evoking similar differences as a crystallized grain in cooled metal. To quote Barker again on another topic on page 73, "For humans, there is a particular crisis of erect posture to be processed. This took me back to the calamitous consequences of the Precambrian explosion, roughly 500 million years ago. Obviously, there are discrete, quasi-coherent neuromotor tick flux patterns, whose incrementally rigidified stages are swimming, crawling, and bipedal walking. Erect posture and the perpendicularization of the skull is a frozen calamity, associated with a long list of pathological consequences, amongst which should be included most of the human psychoneuroses. More simply put, to look at the current human body is to see a single frame of a movie, one that films a calamity that is the universe, happening in slow motion." Now, NASA, being a government-funded program, eventually got fed up with Barker's apparent nonsense, and so he was promptly ridiculed and messily fired, considering the very high clearance he had as a member of NASA's SETI program. This eventually brought him to MVU. TH2, Ballardian Kinesics. Barker drew much of his inspiration from science fiction, in addition to science. J.G. Ballard was just one such of his influences. A medical student and novelist, he preempted the spine as fossil record and DNA memory bank ideas in his 1962 novel, The Drowned World. Ballard's works are notable for a wide variety of very abstract scientific concepts that are very loosely held under the domain of science and not just pure nonsense. Listen, these are very weird people we're talking about, and they wrote very weird things, and I need you to just roll with the punches. Page 76. Any society attaining suitable informatic density and medium massification experiences severe chronotopic leakage. Or in other words, any sufficiently advanced society with communication systems such as ours will begin to experience distortions and feedback loops on the way its members experience time, caused by the structures that they have put in place. Think of just how in the last 20, 30 years, our perspective on the grand scheme of history has been altered by the fact that we've had such rapid developments in technology. This is only one of the ways that time and our experience of it has been distorted. Civilizations will tend to develop an ectopic unconscious, an additional external brain. For us, this is the massified internet, where we have our thinking processes a bit offloaded onto a massive web of interconnected algorithms and thinkers and random public opinions. These Ballardian kinesics are exemplified in the short story The Voice of Time, where a mutant spider develops the capabilities to weave webs that serve as an inflatable neuron system, acting like the brain spread out over a literal web. Now, if time can be taken as a secretion or product of the central nervous system, then altering an organism's biology, and by extension, altering their CNS, impacts their perspective of time. Page 77. For if time is an ejaculate of the nerve, then to alter an organism's nervous system is to move it forward or backwards in organic time. I know that was a funny sentence and I said a funny word, so I'm going to say it again. For if time is an ejaculate of the nerve, then to alter an organism's nervous system is to move it forward or backward in organic time. If we consider sicknesses that alter the body, specifically the central nervous system, we can see that when they alter our biology by interrupting its natural processes, it alters its relative point of presence in an abstract scale of organic time. Ballard explores scenarios where mutants, disturbed by this time sickness, may develop organs adapted to a future need, not yet apparent in function or purpose, like a form of biological intuition. And this can go both ways. Where the characters in his stories may develop organs of unknown use for some point in the future, they are just as liable to develop the skills of their ancestors as new biological appendages, or gill slits, or any number of these strange features. If the autonomic nervous system, the lower spine, is associated with the past that is buried within us, then we can take the cerebrospinal system and its surrounding regions as reaching towards the future as it arrives. In the spinal landscape, so to speak, development is the future arriving early, while structure is the retention of past futures within the body, an entirely novel form of time travel. That didn't make a whole lot of sense, so I'm going to walk us through that again. So, if you see our mental landscape as a sort of spinal landscape in which it is inhabited in the spine for whatever reason, biological development, evolution, is seen as the future arriving early, when our natural biological influences are interrupted and our processes becomes disrupted. We start to develop new functions in our bodies, and the ones that are able to survive are the ones that come from the future because they're the ones suited for the future that allowed the species to evolve into a state that it needs to be. Now, because the futures are becoming retained within the structure of our own biology, those futures are now past futures because they've been retained. They've been made a part of the past. That's a very strange thing to think about, and Ballard was a creative writer, if nothing else. But do keep in mind the idea that physical sickness could be a symptom of chronological disruption. That's just something we're gonna accept and roll with. Read the book if you want to know more. TH3, the law of superposition and biogenetic law. Now, here is where we're getting into the real meat of things. With the information we've put forth, we can now break down spinal catastrophism into two idea clusters. 1. Depth as memory, or the law of superposition, which originated in the 17th century genesis of the geosciences. And then number 2, embryology's theory of recapitulation, or biogenetic law, originating in the absolute idealism of the late 18th century. These emerged from the exacerbation of Enlightenment ideals. Leibniz introduced the idea of continuity, following his success with infinitesimals and differential calculus, applying the same logic of indivisibility to natural substances. He, in essence, biologized infinity, including all of the universe in a scoping domain of life. To him, there was no inorganic matter. Life and death are changes of form, not of nature. Like a Matryoshka doll, all life that will ever be is currently contained within, or at least the plans for, are currently contained within. All visible life, that is. This takes us to the year 1668, where Nicholas Steno introduces the stratigraphic law of superposition. Now, in terms of geognosy, or the origins of the Earth, and geohistory, the further down you go into the Earth, the further back you go in time. Depth is time. The origin of the term deep time. Now, Steno took this idea that the deeper down you go into the ground, the further back you go in time because of fossils and all that, and he solidified this notion that space and body and matter were nothing but coagulated time, casting aside his contemporaries' ideas of time having rotational, sidereal, or calendric motions, favoring instead the chronometric. With the emergence of the scientific fact of comparative anatomy, or the fact that we share similar bone structures with other animals because they evolved from the same base structures, and the discovery that most stars don't exist anymore, referring to the fact that the further away a star is, the longer it takes for light to reach us, and the further back in time appears to be, the body became a chronicle, and Steno's law began to apply to the universe at large. Page 88. Every object is an hourglass. Time is not produced by bodies and motions. All bodily motions are without exception the effluvia of grand time. Now, if you take all of this, pretend you understand it, and apply it to the spine, boom, depth as memory. Now, Moynihan writes that this principle of continuity is eventually abandoned for something more of a principle of mereological alienation. Mereological meaning the relationship of the part to the whole, and between parts within a whole. However, this discussion does bring us to some interesting places. If we contain our history, we don't just contain the history of organic life, we also contain traces of the period before then, before abiogenesis, which brings us to discussions of recapitulation. Now, I'm going to say a bunch of words here because I wrote them down and I'm not sure what actually is a name and what's a title and who's a person. So 1770 to 1830, goes the Zit and Natural Philosophy Speculations, F.W.J. Schelling and Lorenz Oken. God, I need to be better at taking notes. Under Lorenz Oken, the principles of continuity and identity combined to foster the whatever is just notion of Enlightenment idealism. That is the I think, therefore I am idea. Steno's law suggests that because the human spirit contains its outside and recalls its deepest pasts, noogeny, the study of the spirit, includes geoogeny, the study of Earth's formation. However, because there are vast swaths of the spirit's being of which it is not self-conscious, an example, minor motor functions, memory making, and digestion just being such examples, this necessitates the existence of the unconscious, because the conscious brain isn't taking care of that stuff. So, if the past history of the universe is remembered by the human body, and most of that memory is included in the unconscious, then to forget something is not a cognitive lapse, but a principal embodiment of chronology. It's an intended function. Spirit embodies forgetfulness as a body. It takes what it has forgotten and stores it in the unconscious in the physical form of the spine. Evolutionarily speaking, the body is entrenched amnesia. This brings us to Meckel-Serre's law. As a higher order organism develops, it essentially passes through dormant organic phases that lie below it. Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Self-development passes through the processes of species development. If this principle is held to be true, the entire universe as is a fossilized museum of the stages of life's emergence. TH4. Pharyngeal fantasy and spinal polyopton. Ballard utilized Meckel-Serre's law in his writing, saying that an embryo travels through all phases of evolution to reach maturity, and several of the characters in his works express adult features of the ancestor through their mutations. German naturalist Lorenz Oken hypothesized that the entire human body was evolved from a deformed, self-repeating vertebrae. He was one of the most staunch proponents of recapitulation. His deformation hypothesis reasoned that if the body was bilaterally symmetrical along the vertical axis, it might also be in the horizontal. The pelvis and skull were reflections of each other, the hips a sacral brain of sorts. Supporting his theories, but since having been disproved, was the paleontological notion of the second pelvic brain, found in some species of dinosaur, otherwise known as the saurian lumbar brain. This was supposed to be a cluster of nerves that was in charge of the lower functions of the body, such as managing where these large tails belonging to the sauropods and theropods and other pods would do, what they would do. I don't know where the sentence is going. This second brain was supposedly a nerve cluster that would allow saurian entities to manipulate their tails with more grace, rather than relying on signals from the brain at the opposite side of the body. Now, this supposed reflection, Ballard reasoned as an innate desire of the body to return to the symmetry found in earlier forms of life. This calls back to the previous notions of a fall from grace and the loss of radial symmetry. Starfish and urchins are a previously bilateral species that have made such returns to radial symmetry. They've rejected the bilateral schism to return to radial immersion, and as such have retained relatively low neurological complexity. Page 101. Here, we finally reach the core spinal catastrophist contention, that each threshold in life's serial deviations from immersion, central nervous system implosion, spinal wrenching, glottal gonus encasement, instates thanatoxic impulses towards rupturous resolution/return to the surrounding media. This would be the ultimate form of recall, or amnesis. Nature strives constantly for the annihilation of the individual, and that it longs to revert to universal indifference. Essentially, there's an underlying drive of the universe to break individual life forms back into the components that they're made of, to return them to what surrounds them. And because the universe is embodied within the individual, and the individual expresses the underlying drives of the universe, we all have a secret desire to off ourselves. Or so the theory goes. TH5. Literal osteochilopoda cross the wounded galaxies. American writer William S. Burroughs commended Ballard's concept of the sacral brain, but he kinda wanted to separate out a spine into an organism that was separate from the rest of the nervous system. Page 103. Burroughs suggested that the proto-human ape was dragged through its body to expire upon its tongue. Barker recounts. For Burroughs, language is a parasitic organism that possesses the speaker's nervous system. The word, Burroughs characteristically wrote, has not been recognized, as a parasite, because it has achieved a state of symbol symbiosis with the host, and we have no way of ascertaining the invasion in such cases of latent virus infections. Burroughs describes words and language as self-motivated, willful entities that force humans to speak, inciting their, or the parasite's, reproduction through oratory. To say that again in simpler terms, language, as described by Burroughs, is a parasite that uses the human species to reproduce. For a quick experiment, if you stop speaking and then try not to think of words, you're gonna find that you can't help but have thoughts involving words. This is the idea of linguistic virology. The development of the human being was shaped through, essentially, an alien parasite that selected our ancestors for throat structures, and more pressingly, spinal and neural structures that would enable articulate speech. While the idea of a separate species evolving alongside and within the human body is rather strange at first, it's not completely unprecedented. Mitochondria were originally an infection, but they're as much a part as any animal species on the planet as any other part of any animal species on the planet. To take it back one step further, Freeman Dyson theorized that DNA was originally infected by RNA in the sequence of events that would lead to abiogenesis. Returning to Burroughs, in 2010 he released The Soft Machine, which describes proto-apes as coming down with talk sickness, wading into the mud, and then coming out with names. which is a sequence of events which would depict the early stages of this linguistic virus making its way into the human population. This brings us to, of all things, fucking aquatic ape theory. Aquatic ape theory. Now, Moynihan describes how female apes were theorized to have possibly escaped predators by wading into deeper waters where they could not be reached. Not only would this provide them with an adequate, lasting source of protection, but it could also be the origination of the archetypes of the oceanic and the maternal crossing over. As well, because an upright swimming posture would be more beneficial to the ape population, orthograde spines would assist in survival. As well, this would encourage verbal communication, as the gestures and olfactory communication common to proto-human species would be inhibited by the water. You can't always produce an olfactory sense like a hormone or a chemical signal when you're wet and surrounded by liquid or fluid, and you can't really use your hands to send gestures when you're using them to stay afloat. However, accepting this notion, all of these survival adaptations came at a terrible cost to the structure of our back. If you know anything about chiropractics, it's pretty fucked up. We'll talk about it later. Now, a side effect of evolving an orthograde posture was that our front paws, or our hands, were no longer needed to walk and move around on the ground, which meant they could be used for grasping, which is what they evolved to do. So our lips, which were previously our primary means of manipulating and grasping food, no longer had to do so, which means that they could evolve instead to support speech. This further draws connections between aquatic ape theory and linguistic virology. Now, there's also a note here in Moynihan's writing about how misogyny could have possibly originated from changes in sexual positions as necessitated from the female posture. But that's pretty fucked up to think about, and we're not going to think about it, so we're going to move on. When Burroughs discovered this relationship of biology and word, he raised questions of the potency of language. With as ingrained as language is in our biology, how much damage can a word really do? And with now massified media through a global internet, how fast could that possible damage spread? On page 109, he, Burroughs, asked whether one could produce a string of words and images that could induce death, a death tape. Now, if you're familiar with the SCP Foundation or the Despair Code, this is very reminiscent of mimetic kill switches and viruses that are found in such fictional works. When you present the correct form of communication, you could potentially alter a victim's biology. It's like saying the right password to unlock the master control. This, of course, is a very unsettling thought to think about, and a lot of people in the Foundation have thought about this at length and talked about it much more in depth than what I'm going to here. In Spinal Catastrophism, we don't really delve too much more into this concept, but we do ask the question: is the current stage of global communications a late phase of a ticking biological time bomb? TH6, Philosophical Anthropology's Mangel Swesson. Not everyone who's thought about the spine has followed these ideas of it being ruinous for the human species. Of course, it is still why we hold dominion over planet Earth. But most who have looked at it have had to accept that it's at least a double-edged sword. Page 111. It is because we stand that we can fall, and because we stand for ourselves that falling is our fault. And it is precisely that self-accountability that first forces us to produce the technical processes that unleashed our power over the globe. This is a particularly moving line to me. I want you to think about that idea. It is because we stand that we can fall. It is only because we were able to reach a higher level of understanding that we're capable of falling back down into the animal instinct. We elevated ourselves above the animal level to the rational level of existence. And because we stand for ourselves, that falling is our fault. When we have this rational understanding that we are above the animal level, if we ever fall back down to the actions of our base instinct, we're capable of recognizing when what we're doing is amoral. And if we're capable of recognizing that something that we're doing is immoral, we are capable of preventing ourselves from falling back down through the structure. And it is precisely that self-accountability that first forces us to produce the technical processes that unleash our power over the globe. Because we want to prevent ourselves from falling back down into those previous stages, we produce the structures necessary to keep ourselves in line. Religion, civilization, community, accountability. These structures keep us in line. That way, we do not fall back down to the animal level. And because these structures allow us to succeed, we want the structures to succeed, which means they need to spread. And because those structures need to spread, they spread around the entire globe. And with every step that we take to spread that structure becomes better at allowing us to spread the structure. We become more involved in life the more involved we are. We're going back to that idea. The structures that we've created to keep ourselves from falling down allowed us to dominate the globe. That is an eye-opening concept to look at, and something that probably could be dived in a little bit deeper than what I'm going to right now, but we're gonna move fast anyways because there's still God knows how many chapters here. So, if we have the power to redesign our world as we see fit, we also have to come to recognize that's the same power we could use to destroy the planet. This recognition is something that Moynihan writes about in his other book, but I think that we're going to get more into it as we go along through this one as well. In neurologist Erwin Strauss's The Upright Posture, the shape, function, and perspective of the human body are seen to be determined by our upright posture. Strauss noticed that the new action spaces in the hand, which provided another set of tools to work with, shifted our primary senses from olfactory dominance to visual dominance. Because our mouth is no longer our primary grasping tool, it didn't need to remain directly in front of our eyes where we could oversee its operations. Because our mouth is no longer in front of our eyes, our focus was freed to be shifted further out. We can concentrate our resting gaze on more remote items of interest. No longer are we focused on the immediacy, we're capable of seeing what's coming ahead of us. We became capable of foresight. Whereas most animals move in the direction of their digestive axes, we instead move in the direction of our vision. We're capable of breaking from the instincts of our stomach to follow with the instincts of our brain. This brings us to the notes of German philosopher Hans Blumenberg. He wrote that the shift to this new perspective was a shocking confrontation with the terrifying absolutism of reality. In another comparison to the story of Adam and Eve, just as being naked wasn't a problem until we were aware of our nakedness, so too was reality not a problem until we were aware of reality. This goes back to the ideas of the chronotope and the self-simulation that evolved in the central nervous system. As reality became more a part of our life and we were capable of understanding that time existed and that the future was coming, that became a problem for us because we now were capable of getting stressed out about it. Blumenberg also wrote that because maintaining an upright gait is a constant balancing act against natural forces like gravity, human nature is arranged so that reaching towards a higher objective requires fighting but never fully overcoming the natural world. Maintaining balance, just like maintaining a rational worldview, requires micro-adjustments of your stances as new stimuli are introduced. If you continue the same actions without adjusting your trajectory, you're going to fall over and fall into bad habits. You need to maintain a certain level of flexibility in how you think about and observe the world. Roth and Dick, 2013, found that mental and behavioral flexibility are good measures of intelligence. This brings us to the idea of neoteny. Neoteny is the retention of juvenile features into adulthood. One such example of neoteny comes with neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is a fairly infantile feature retained by humans far into adulthood, which allows for a greater degree of intelligence. Neuroplasticity is, of course, the ability for the human brain to adapt to new patterns over time, for it to observe what is happening and then form new connections that allow it to better process these stimuli. If you're familiar with anthropology and primatology, this is only one of many features that is expressed both by adult humans and baby apes. This brings us to the idea that humans were born early, so that we can grow longer outside of the womb. German psychologist and philosopher Arnold Galen published Der Mensch, seine Natur und Unsteinsiedlung in der Welt in 1940. I don't know what that translates to, and frankly, I don't care. He picked up on the following ideas. From Nietzsche, he gathered that humans are the not yet determined being. From Johann Gottfried Herder, he found that humans are the creature of deficiencies, the Mangelswesen. What does Mangelswesen mean? I'm gonna look that up right now. Why didn't I write this? Mangelswesen. I can't find an easy translation of this. We're going to move on. As well, Galen wrote that, in comparison to animals, our anatomy is a bit of a paradox. Page 121. Our upright gait, that special morphological position, is the central feature of the peculiar human bodily structure, expressing the fact that our species is characterized by deficiencies and a lack of adaptations. And yet, such an inheritance of undetermination is not only an endowment of plasticity, but precisely also a summons to action. His very body presents a problem and challenge to him. He is spurred to develop an attitude towards and make something of himself. Facing a real chance of perishing, man is ultimately an anticipatory being. As Galen hits on here, it is because the human body does not provide us innately with the tools we need to survive. We need to adapt and overcome those challenges as a requisite of our survival. We have to learn to overcome our bodily structures to become something more, or else we will perish. And in order to do that, we have to anticipate the future. In order to engage with the future, we have to risk what we have in the present in order to possibly gain something more at a later date in time. It is only by putting our mostly defenseless selves at risk that we are capable to secure continued existence. We are taking risks so that we might continue to stay alive. We are taking the chances that we will fall in order to stand upright. Because we are liable to fall, we are responsible for standing upright. Man is the embodied impossibility. He is the animal that lives anyways. And we see more of this from Nikolai Fedorov, a Russian philosophical anthropologist from the 1900s. The least protected creature, man asserted himself by standing upright. Through this, we discovered space and time, relating ourselves to the heavens and becoming aware of our mortality. From there, we utilized artifice to externalize our bodily functions. An example, digestion became cooking, liberating us further from the facts of animal existence. German physician and anthropologist Paul Ausberg noted this as well. Removed from the care of nature, man became the first creature to become fully accountable for its own survival. We became distinct. We were no longer under the care of our natural instinct. This left us with quite the heavy burden of our own survival, but it freed us to become so much more, which also in turn gave us a lot more burdens to deal with. Going back to more of what Moynihan said before, we became really good at killing things. Almost too good, in fact. Nukes and nanobots show the reality of our potential for omnicide on planet Earth. This brings us to French paleoanthropologist Leroy Garoun from the 1960s. He predicted that humans would exhaust the limits of self-exteriorization, limited by their fleshy relics of a body. We would eventually come to an end of what we were capable of doing with technology without forgoing our human bodies. He thought that this would be seen as cause for secession of the spirit from the biological human sapiens into an autonomous and mechanical immortality. If we ever got to the point where we could equip our tools with full capacity for thought, we biological humans would instantly become living fossils, pollinators of ascendant machines that would eventually fade into paleontological twilight. This is a rather scary concept, but there's another interesting one that comes with it. There's the idea that man would eventually become a parasite to the very mechanical prosthetics that we create. Now, parasites are known to lose self-sufficiency after a certain point of time. Parasites eventually evolve as a species or individually mature to become incapable of surviving by themselves. Imagine a world where the parasite of language inhabits a human form, and then uses that human form to construct an external mechanical body for itself, only for the previous body that it was using to become the parasite of the relationship by overtaking the mechanical functions. What was previously the tool for moving forward becomes the limit holding it back. It's a pretty comedic irony, and one we'll unfortunately come back to. Now, Karl Marx, of all people, saw such a potential. He foresaw that technologization leads to a reversal of subject and object, a thingification of persons and a personification of things. Here's another gem of a line for you. Walter Benjamin had proposed that the vertical spine brings with it a phenomenon unprecedented in natural history. Partners can look into each other's eyes during orgasm. Only then does an orgy become possible. What are you doing after the orgy? What is this book? The gist of these ideas is this. Uprightness is a burden, a continual toil that our species undergoes. Our falling upwards from passivity into activism was a summons to become rational. Page 131. Spinal Catastrophism takes this essentially tragic lesson to heart. The conditions for reason, enlightenment, and face-to-face speech, or sex, are the enablers of pain, perversion, and exodus from any home on the horizon. While our condition provides us with great boons, addressing the downsides of this existence requires a therapy that runs deeper than what psychoanalysis can prescribe. These wounds reach back into the origins of not just terrestrial life, but the substance of the galaxies themselves. TH7. Vertebral Humorism. Astronomer Fred Hoyle was a contemporary of Barker, who had an interest in extraterrestrial viruses, backwards causation, and the relationships between cosmic events and human prehistory. Hoyle believed that Velikovsky's work was unsound, to be sure, but thought that his Worlds in Collision revealed a troubling response from the astronomic community. Velikovsky, a trained psychoanalyst, was not an astronomer or an archaeologist. He derived his theories from his preferred field of psychology. Velikovsky traced origins of religion through Hume and Montesquieu to dizzying extremes, believing myth and legend arose from memory traces of interplanetary interactions coded into our very being. After putting forth such ideas into academia, his publisher was threatened with boycotts from a borderline neurotic reaction in the scientific community. Velikovsky believed that such a reaction only served to reveal how deeply wounding these devastating biological traumas must be, for them to elicit such a visceral response. In On the Physical Existence of the Noetic World, Velikovsky believed that there may be a noetic world, relating the common memories and experiences that have been preserved in the unconscious of every human. This noetic world, noetic meaning of ideas, would be a sort of immortality of experience. However, Velikovsky, as strange a man as he was not the only one to agree with such sentiments. Page 137. Velikovsky recounted in 1931 that he had sent his article to a fellow researcher, who approvingly affirmed that he was in complete agreement with Velikovsky's conclusions on the matter. Indeed, this fellow explorer of the unconscious of mankind would return, throughout his life, to the question of recapitulation and inorganic memory. His name? Sigmund Freud. And here's where things get interesting. TH8, Psychoanalytic Flexion. I believe this motherfucker needs no introductions. Freud's pre-psychoanalytic work involved mapping neuroanatomy and the phylogenetic path of ganglion cells. Now, this was back when he was looking at the nervous systems of lampreys, a comparatively basal vertebrate when you're looking at that versus humans. In his own words, his progression of profession was from working with the spinal cord of the lowest of fishes up to the human central nervous system. Much of his early work echoed into the latter. He believed that bipedality contributed much to sight's role in human sexuality, as compared to the olfactory senses. In layman's terms, he believed there's a good reason why you like looking at bigga booba instead of smelling them. He also traced schizophrenic analysis to a Jurassic landscape, echoing later sentiments that schizophrenic tendencies originated in a time-displaced sense of being. Unpublished papers of Freud's that were later found after his death showed that he believed that all individuals developmentally repeat Ice Age traumas. As well, Moynihan covers several parallels made by Freud in comparing the origins of primordial organisms and the formation of the Earth. William Reich, on the other hand, was a student of Freud and an enemy of both the US and, ironically enough, the Third Reich. Another psychologist, Romain Rolland, had suggested to Freud the idea of an oceanic feeling of egoic dissolution, who had found the notion alluring, but ultimately rejected it. Reich, however, sought this notion out. He developed characterological analysis, extending the topographical maps of psychoanalysis to the rhythms of the body, in a notion that presaged Ballardian kinesics. This biological depth of drives and desires were layered in an order of biogenetic to phylogenetic to ontogenetic succession. These stratified layers of geological history appeared as armoring, rigid biological structures arising to protect the ingrained traumas that were built into the human nervous system. The spine could be seen as a worm of sorts, originating from a previously orgasmic phase of life that had since lost its joy and calcified to suit the needed structure, forming its bony armor shell in order to protect itself from its new strange world. I'm not simping at all. Be warned, I'm simplifying a lot here. It's a kind of confusing idea. We, essentially, long to return to the orgasmic pulsation of the oceanic flow, ridding ourselves of this rigid bilateral and vertebral impalement. We want to get rid of the stick up our ass and start just existing without much of a purpose. That's the goal. That's the ultimate good here. We came out of it, we got into something else, and we kind of want to go back. That's a running theme here. There's a lengthy discussion of how the act of orgasm brings us much closer to radial symmetry, but I'm not going to talk about it. Read it for yourself. Anyways, Moynihan also uses the phrase muscle memory, except muscle is spelled like the type of sea fish. Sea fish? Shellfish. Carl Jung! Archetypes. Archetypes were Carl Jung's thing, very much so. The archetype of the serpent could be found in our own spinal system, as the spinal cord leads down into the sympathetic nervous system and its undulating movements. Jung believed that our unconsciousness existed outside of our brains, locating it to a sort of counterbrain at the solar plexus, associated with lower life forms. He also talked a lot about dinosaurs, appropriate given that his favorite metaphor for the phyletic memes was a saurian tail that dragged behind us. Anyways, all of this ties back into what we were just talking about a little bit ago about the saurian second brain, which was opposite of the head in the pelvis, which was another thing we talked about. It's neat, these things connect together. Now, all of this talks of dinosaurs makes me want to talk about the paleontology/geology of the soul. Jung described a metaphor that saw personality as emerging from stacked layers of groups. These groups being individual, on top of family, on top of clan, on top of nation, etc., etc., etc. However, there was, amidst all of these different layers of the groups to which the individual belongs, a central fire rising from the base of the system to the peak like a volcanic shaft. This model shows how the single individual exists as a stacking of layers of groups, where each lower layer contains and also fully contributes to the higher layers above it, and also implies that the highest layer, the individual, could also exist as a sort of group, containing multiple personalities within the single person. Going back to the idea of decentralized but connected centers of our own internal thought process, Jung pointed out that worms are the most basic nervous structures, being utterly decentralized, with each segment nearly an independent organism. However, despite this apparent disconnect and independence of function, the worm is still very much a single organism. The nature of the worm helps Jung's arguments that the unconsciousness can exist outside of the brain, in other parts of our body. And with as much as the spine looks like a worm, it's not a terrible argument. It's not bad. It's not the worst. TH9. Terrestrialization and Traumatism. Sándor Ferenczi was a Hungarian protege of Freud. While Freud speculated that we were enacting Ice Age traumas, Sándor went even further, saying that we're still coping with the transition to life on land. Cope. Cry about it. In 1924, Ferenczi wrote Thalassa, A Theory of Genitality. Just as the derived neonate, us, longs for regressus ad uterum, a return to the peace of the womb, our escape from ocean to land, in parallel to previous discussions of escape through isolation, instills in us a longing to return to the sea. This is known as thalassotropism. But to take it further, this in itself is just a reflection of an even deeper desire for organic life to compulsively extinct itself, collapsing back into a sort of pre-life goo, calling back to Freud's idea of the death drive. We see in this repeating layers of, we escaped a previous surrounding of relative apathy into a heightened manner of existence, but we feel a drive to return to that previous state. This causes trauma. Then we also get some weird discussion of breastfeeding being a newborn's desire to bore its way back into the maternal flesh, and once again, what is this book? Furthermore, Ferenczi pointed out that when we sleep, we may often emulate a radial shape, as the so-called soul migrates into the lower spine. Curling up into a ball while you sleep is a form of temporary decapitation. If the mind goes further down into the spine, then by our previous analysis, it's also going further back in time and deeper into the unconscious, which could possibly be why dreams are so weird. Okay, so this next idea I need to kind of very clearly lay out. If the body is a deposited record of time in biological form, and there are processes it can undergo which call forth ancient psychological states of being, then can a body undergo similar processes which call forth previous physiological states? More so, if an organ gets out of step, so to say, with the biological present of the body, and recalls information from the past, or even the future that is ingrained within its structure, this could create a malignant effect on the body, as the organ is either no longer fulfilling its function, or conducting one that the body is not prepared to execute. This leads us to the thought that organic disease could be a form of time travel. That's weird. And if organic disease can be read this way, mental disorders can be read as the same. To call a little ways back to the discussion of evolution of language as a parasite, could the central nervous system be a preemptive expression of organs designed for rational thought that were introduced into our ancestors through these chronological aberrations? The system for the central nervous system was developed in our ancestors because they had the memories of the future hidden within them. That's wild. Sándor Ferenczi theorized even further that maybe life itself could just be one of these prolonged hypnagogic jerks, with existence itself just a temporary step out from the inorganic rhythm of reality, a drawn-out chronopathy, or time disease. Another crazy idea he put out in 1916 was that money and other forms of capital were derived from a biological desire to play with our own poop. Repressing our urge to do that outright for fear of disease, we engage with this drive through a more sanitized form of filthy lucre. Page 155. In this way, even capital itself is derived from Ferenczi's biogenetic ground principle of phylogenetic repetitiveness. To reach this conclusion, the Hungarian rallied the argument that capitalism is not purely practical and utilitarian, but libidinous and irrational. Imagine that. Georges Bataille was a French philosopher and also another man in a long list of bee names that are important to this book. An example, Barker, Ballard, Burroughs, and Blumenberg. We'll see more of them later. With the advent of the World Wars, he saw these global conflicts as the greatest orgies of wealth and of human beings that history has ever recorded. All of this was just another way of expending our extra libidinous sex energy that was being repressed by the society we had produced. As well, he had the thought that if a closed system, like a planet, has an endpoint where all resources may be totally exhausted, then every process, no matter how utilitarian it seems, is part of a wanton and squandrous effort to reach that terminal point. You know, a wanton and squandrous effort does seem like a pretty apt description for World War I. This also ties to the previous point about capitalism. While we're on the topic of Bataille, this isn't in the book, I don't think, but I did find some more information about it while I was researching Bataille. So, he points out that the existence of the big toe is also one of humanity's defining factors. The big toe was, at one point, a derived thumb, and compared to the rest of the great apes, it sits uniquely flat against the ground, like all of our other toes. No other ape has thumbs like this. Our plantigrade posture, palm fully adapted to face the earth, allows us to stand more easily upright, and helps to separate us from our primate relatives. This is just another neat thing about our posture that kind of ties into the book, and so I wanted to put it here. TH10. Ancient Azygy of the Pineal Sunblossom. Bataille described existence as a durable orgasm, and once again, I ask myself what this book is fucking talk about, because for Bataille, the end of the orgasm is death. He pinpointed two terrestrial axes: the vertical escape from the terrestrial sphere, lorded by tides and plants, and the horizontal domain of beasts. Humans are the only animals to have escaped from the latter into the former, leaving the knuckle-dragging apes as a sort of diagonal halfway point. Where Kant linked verticality to rationality, Bataille saw this as a mere rerouting of anal motivations, which now blossomed upwards as a delirious cranial flower. This upwards notion, corked by the right angle of the mouth to the spine, is relieved through the mouth in spastic motions of laughter, coitus, and emotional torment, somewhat like water through a bent hose. Likening even the fusion that drives the sun to a thermonuclear orgasm, us strange plants are drawn upwards towards the sun by a pineal eye at the skull's summit. That pineal eye is important. Some species of fish, amphibians, and reptiles have a parietal third eye, which is photoreceptive, meaning that it is sensitive to light. They can't actually see out of it, but they can detect when there's light overhead. These species include the petromyzon, or sea lamprey, that Freud was studying during the 1880s, when this third eye was discovered. While humans no longer have such organs, our reptilian ancestors may certainly have. And you want to know what we still have that was connected to that third eye? The pineal gland. The mysterious part of our brain responsible for regulating our hormones and our sleep cycle. Ain't that a mighty interesting coincidence? Our ancient inner clock is directly linked to the sun. And also, the pineal gland is prone to calcification, as if we haven't already discussed theories of nervous systems becoming bony to form the spinal cord. You see it, you're seeing it now, it all connects back to each other. TH11, Chiropraxis, Tarzan philosophers, and penis poeticisms. If Bataille is right, the leaps of progress in the last few centuries aren't the outcomes of cunning reason, but rather the orgasmic releases of global traumatic tension. This brings us to English writer D.H. Lawrence. Velikovsky would later speak of peripheral nerves as telepathic communicators, but Lawrence beat him to the punch with his theory of vertebral telepathy. Lawrence saw that there were two forms of mutually exclusive communication: mental and vertebral, stronger in the brain and not brain regions of the body respectively. The latter being the true form of communication in animals, a form of herd instinct still present in humans. Page 164. This is what makes the magic of a leader like Napoleon. His power of sending out intense vibrations, messages to his men, without the exact intermediation of mental correspondence. It is the stupendous wit of brainless intelligence, a marvelous reversion to the pre-mental form of consciousness. In Caesar and Napoleon, the vertebral influence of power prevailed. Essentially, the majority of people in society tend to think a little bit more like lizards, as a collective group. When we see revolts like the Russian and French revolutions, it's like some great collective idea has swelled beneath the crusted surface of the docile masses, then erupted to overtake the civilization that confines and tortures it. Page 165. Hegel, characteristically, had imagined the zeitgeist of massified history as an old mole, churning under the planetary mantle, until, grown strong in itself, it bursts asunder the crusts of the earth which divided it from the sun. But rather than Hegel's flaming nous and its return to solar identity, for Lawrence, the masses and their oncoming waves of revolution now represent instead a stony serpent spine revenant of ancient reptile mindedness, torquing through the rock of ages. Take a shot every time we see another B name in this book. German philosopher Ernst Bloch was a devout Marxist, so you know this is going to be good. Instead of seeing revolution as a sort of downwards lapse, any rebellious uprising was more attributable to a skyward surge of our upright gait. Opposing Reich's biotherapy, for Ernst, the backbone was the basis for a Marxist Promethean demand to transcend all bondages. The Marxist use of the word praxis, the creative expression unique to man that changes the historical world, can more accurately be stated here as chiropraxis. The modernist desire to return to the pronograde was nothing but dirty backwardness to a Marxist like Bloch. Seeing the psychoanalytical, primitivist, and vitalist schools as nothing more than Tarzan philosophers, he railed against them for hating the future, fleeing the present, and searching for the past. From Bloch's ire, D.H. Lawrence himself earned the title of sentimental penis poet. For him, the night side of natural science did nothing but squabble around in the dark of the past. Bloch further attacks the vitalism of French philosopher Henry Bogson, and I swear to Christ that Moynihan went out of his way to grab every B-list B-initial thinker this side of Bermuda. British writer Wyndham Lewis presented his 1927 Time and Western Man, a 600-page multi-front assault on the field of time philosophy and the tyranny of the cephalized brain over the unconscious body. He proposed that our mind is like an anthill, with the many smaller insects subjugated for the needs and benefits of a monarchical consciousness. We could function well without this royal parasite, which leads the unconscious many to often fight against the intellectual pinnacle of the body. The Western man, as Lewis described, sees the higher mind not only lording over the animal aspect of being, but behaving as if it had not arisen from the same humble past. The revolts of modernity were an act of regicide that left the mind sitting amidst its angry constituents. Important to note here, spinal reflex arcs are a type of neural pathway that control involuntary movements, and it's notable that they don't pass through the brain. This implies that there are major controlling bodily functions that are independent of the central nervous system. We now turn our attention in this ridiculously long chapter to Irish crystallographer, futurologist, and communist J.D. Bernal. So take another shot, this time with an ounce of Bailey's Irish Cream. Bernal observed that while we've reformatted much of our surrounding world, we've made very little change to humanity itself, at least biologically speaking. Bernal believed that we are on the cusp of liberating the reproductive system to a mere technological process, which he thought would render the non-neural systems of the body as largely useless. Parasites, even. Page 173. The increasing complexity of man's existence, particularly the mental capacity required to deal with its mechanical and physical complications, gives rise to the need for much more complex sensory and motor organization, and even more fundamentally, for a better organized cerebral mechanism. Sooner or later, the useless parts of the body must be given modern functions or dispensed with altogether. The Promethean scientists of the future would potentially loosen the bonds of their liable organic structures, becoming nothing more than brains with a spinal tail plugged into new, durable bodies of artifice. Moynihan takes the time to point out that Bernal's desired end goal isn't much different in appearance than the primordial deforms as described by Reich, a sort of neurological jellyfish. Also, Barker was rumored to have been involved with one Maximilian Crabbe, a billionaire who, in a very eccentric and very gruesome billionaire thing to do, had himself dismembered and inserted into various vats to prepare for a potential life of humanity on the seafloor. This can be found in CCRU Writings 141-3. We'll come back to that later. Bernal's vision of man as a robotic, cylindrical communist overman resembles, at least in part, the aliens in H.P. Lovecraft's At the Mountains of Madness. Lovecraft, funny enough, is actually going to come up later, but not really related to this. But now, the man himself, Karl Marx. He wasn't really on board with Lois or Bernal's ideas of liberation, mostly because of how fucking weird they were, but he looked more in the direction of expanding mankind's inorganic body over the rest of the globe. To him, locomotives and telegraphs represented the power of knowledge objectified. For Karl Marx, if the entire globe could be a single connected brain, then this was something to strive for. Moynihan points out that amongst the various attitudes of this era, most to all of them agreed that modernity faces a real urge to collapse into a backwards regression. This is a troubling thought for anyone who is a fan of society and would like it to continue. TH12. Global Vertebral Telegraphy and Neural Newsiet. In 1877, German philosopher Ernst Kamp published a theory of organic projections, claiming that technology was nothing but an outwards inversion of our bodily functions. Once again, fire helps us digest, weapons help us maim and kill, and the electrical telegraph was our first step towards a global neural system. Kopp, like others, noted how these cable networks resembled cerebral spinal arcs in the ways they overlapped and conveyed information from one point to another. Kopp's organ projection, Akropolo's conviction that the laws of physics were nothing but the externalized reflex arcs of some cosmic alien technology. Page 178. Kopp, moreover, noticed that it is solely through organ projection that we recognize the impulse human nature has to reflect itself in itself. The human being knows itself in the special way it does because it everts itself so as to reflect back upon itself. It is the artifact of its own artifice. So, as Blumenberg and Alsberg hinted, we are our neural prostheses. In other words, human beings know so much about and are so familiar with human beings because we keep putting the personality and traits of human beings onto inanimate objects that we create. These tools that we've created reflect our traits back onto us. To quote William Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, "And just as the eye sees not itself, but by reflection, by some other things." In this manner, the telegraph becomes a way for the sentient animal to reflect its nature back onto itself, becoming aware of the whole of humanity as a cosmopolitan community. It was only by assembling a planetary scale brain that we began to think like a planet. What we refer to as globalization is our collective realization that our species is undergoing encephalization, that we are forming a brain. Page 180. Becoming globally focalized can do nothing but facilitate more global focalization. Globalization is its own awareness of itself, and since the brain is the organ of awareness, globalization demands a globe brain, and the telegraphic planet spine represents the outwards concretization of this process. That old mole torquing through the crust, the so-called human spirit, that liquid lava rising up through the layers of groups of the human structure, was extended from vertebral telepathy into vertebral telegraphy. Page 180. In 1883, Krakatoa in Indonesia erupted, one of the biggest eruptions of the Holocene. It was also the first natural disaster to be known instantly across the globe. The first massified calamity. Telegraphic news of the cataclysm reached foreign shores before the shockwave did. We also note that the rubber used to insulate the undersea telegraph cables that were used to convey this message came from latex trees only found in Indonesia, the island that produced the neural sheaths for our global cerebrum, also produced the first globally focalized disaster. Isn't that an interesting coincidence? Friedrich Engels, a German philosopher and socialist, saw that a sort of feedback loop was forming in human society, where our posture facilitated easier labor, and that labor created conditions that promoted further spinal erection. The two factors, labor and spinal erection, caused each other, converging on a sort of homo economicus. Ironically enough, though, back pain seems to be one of the major obstacles to modern labor. Anthropologist Elaine Morgan found that in a single year in the UK, lower back pain caused the loss of 19 million working days. As well, 70% of Americans will face back pain at some point in their lives. This paints a picture where the very thing that is allowing us to do more labor is also causing us to be able to do less labor. Our relationship with labor that was once a boon is becoming a malady. Of course, our other example of symbiosis with the abstract, in language and reason, shows that these relationships can become retroactively parasitic. The pains caused by the pursuit of labor may be the labor pains of continuing to carry forth this conceptual burden via our own biology. What we're working towards birthing, I'm not quite sure. I don't believe I can quite do justice to the closing remarks of the thoracic retrospect, but the gist is this. The future helps cause itself. Our horror at the past is the pull of the past upon us, and schizophrenia may provide a key insight into our perception of time. And having finished the thoracic retrospect, we are like halfway through the book, a little over halfway through the book, and probably halfway through all of the footage that I have recorded thus far. This was exceptionally long, longer than I expected for it to go on for, though I probably should have had some grander expectations considering exactly how long it took me to record it. I am recording this section of the video a month after I started doing the audio editing, which was probably 2 months after I had done the original recording for the audio itself. I'll admit, burning your hand in a grease fire does make it difficult to edit. But with that, I'm gonna have to call this video to a close. I don't know if I can physically handle doing any more audio editing right now. I need to put something out the door or else I'm going to lose my mind. So with that, please stay tuned for the next installment of this series where we will continue examining the rest of this giant yet very, very small book and really get into what I want to get into, which is the repercussions of all of this. So please, if I don't put out another video for another 3-4 months after this, know that the pain of putting this first one together, physically and mentally, has been so great that I fear doing the second half. But as always, take care and freak out.